Hey guys, tonight we drift into one of history's strangest little corners, a place filled with silk gowns, whispered scandals, and suspiciously expensive apartments. The uncomfortable realization was that your entire lifestyle depended on one extremely unhealthy man surviving another winter. Tonight, we're talking about royal mistresses after the king died. Honestly, the answer was usually nothing good. Before we settle into this candlelit parade of emotional disasters, take a moment to like and subscribe. Maybe you're wrapped in blankets in a rainstorm, or awake in the dark while your brain refuses to power down like a medieval monastery candle. Now dim the lights. Let's wander into the unstable world of women who lived beside absolute power, right up until the moment that power vanished. Because kings died all the time, and when they did, entire worlds collapsed overnight, especially for the women who loved them or tolerated them professionally. Being a royal mistress was one of the least stable jobs. You had no official protections, no guaranteed inheritance, and no legal authority. Your existence depended on remaining useful, attractive, or less annoying than the queen. While kings could adore you for years, the second they died, things changed. Courts were ecosystems like elegant little shark tanks covered in perfume. The moment a king stopped breathing, alliances shifted and doors literally closed in faces. Let's float to France. The monarchy there treated mistresses like semi-official government departments, especially under Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. Louis XIV's court was the gold standard for royal chaos. Everything glittered, and everything smelled faintly of orange blossoms and political paranoia. Madame de Montespan was brilliant at court life. She was sharp, stylish, and ruthlessly charming in an environment where humiliation was an Olympic sport. But favor is fragile. Louis drifted toward Madame de Maintenon, religious and reserved. Suddenly, Montespan found herself slipping. A colder greeting here, a delayed invitation there. Imagine spending years at the absolute center of the universe, only to slowly realize the universe has moved 3 feet to the left without you. Under Charles II of England, things were different. He filled his court with actresses and gamblers. One of his favorites was the witty Nell Gwynn. Charles genuinely adored her, but even Nell understood the instability. When Charles collapsed in 1685, panic spread. The new king, James II, was very different. Nell reportedly begged Charles on his deathbed not to let her starve. Charles supposedly answered, "Let not poor Nellie starve." Practical financial planning, honestly. Many were not so lucky. Some were expelled overnight or entered convents. Imagine going from Versailles diamonds to waking up at dawn beside turnips. Then there were historical ghosts, women who were famous but simply faded. Male chroniclers were deeply unfair, reducing influential women to mere temptresses. Madame de Pompadour was an intellectual force and political advisor. She influenced everything from architecture to philosophy, but she could never fully relax. As public resentment grew, mistresses became perfect scapegoats, extravagant, visible, and vulnerable. An absolute disaster combination historically. Europe would soon enter an age where even kings weren't safe. We'll drift into that royal catastrophe next time. Good night for now. Now, where were we? Ah, yes. Europe was slowly approaching one of its favorite historical hobbies, collapsing dramatically after spending too much money on decorative ceilings. And unfortunately for royal mistresses, they often found themselves standing directly beside the throne when the shouting started, which was not ideal, because for centuries, mistresses had existed in a strange, protected world, a place where wealth appeared magically. Apartments materialized inside palaces. Jewel collections expanded mysteriously every birthday. Entire careers depended on smiling politely at the correct dinner table. But then came the 18th century, and suddenly ordinary people across Europe began developing deeply inconvenient ideas about equality. A terrible development for anybody living in 12-room silk apartments funded by taxes, especially in France. Before the full revolutionary chaos arrived, the French monarchy had already become something almost surreal in its extravagance. Court rituals at Palace of Versailles had grown so elaborate that noblemen sometimes competed for the honor of handing the king his shirt. Imagine destroying your entire afternoon because Greg from Burgundy might get closer to the royal sleeve than you. History is amazing. And inside this glittering machine lived one of the last great royal mistresses of old France, Madame du Barry. Jeanne Bécu, later known as Madame du Barry, came from surprisingly modest beginnings, which immediately made half the aristocracy furious. French nobles could tolerate scandal, they could tolerate affairs, but social climbing, unforgivable. Du Barry entered court life through a haze of gossip and resentment. She was beautiful, charming, and socially clever. And eventually she caught the attention of Louis XV. Now Louis XV by this point was aging, exhausted, and emotionally drifting. France itself was struggling financially. Public frustration simmered constantly beneath the polished surface of court life, but Versailles continued sparkling anyway. Du Barry became the king's official favorite and inherited all the strange ceremonial expectations, lavish gowns, elaborate etiquette. One of her greatest enemies was the young Marie Antoinette, who famously refused to speak to Du Barry for long stretches of time. Eventually, Marie Antoinette reluctantly addressed her with the famously cold line, "There are many people at Versailles today." Then, in 1774, Louis XV contracted smallpox. Now, smallpox at Versailles created immediate terror. It shattered the illusion of royal perfection. And almost overnight, Du Barry's entire world collapsed. Courtiers abandoned her instantly. Servants switched loyalties. So Du Barry was removed from court almost immediately, exiled to a convent first, because monarchies loved religious isolation for uncomfortable female problems. One week you're attending candle-lit royal dinners. The next week you're eating silent soup, while nuns avoid discussing your previous lifestyle. Except Europe was preparing another terrible idea, the French Revolution. Former royal mistresses were practically walking symbols of excess. Du Barry became associated with everything revolutionaries hated: luxury, court favoritism, silk curtains worth more than entire villages. In 1793, Madame du Barry was executed by guillotine. According to witnesses, she was absolutely terrified. Now, interestingly, not all former royal mistresses ended so tragically. Some adapted remarkably well by becoming extremely practical. Under George IV, royal relationships became more giant public soap opera with wigs. One longtime companion was Maria Fitzherbert. George secretly married her in 1785, even though it was legally invalid. Emotionally, she was his wife. Legally, she was paperwork. One pattern appears constantly: survival depended on disappearing gracefully. The women who fought publicly usually lost. One fascinating example is Diane de Poitiers, who managed to remain influential for decades despite being older than King Henry II. In 1559, Henry II suffered a horrific jousting accident. A splintered lance entered his eye during a tournament. Catherine de' Medici stepped forward into power. Diane's position evaporated. She was forced to return the Château de Chenonceau. Imagine losing the central person in your life while simultaneously being treated like an embarrassing administrative problem. As Europe moved into the 19th century, royal mistresses began changing. Public scrutiny intensified. Scandal became mass entertainment. By the 19th century, being a royal mistress had become much more dangerous. Not physically, at least not most of the time, emotionally, socially, reputationally. Because now there was a new force wandering through Europe with ink-stained fingers and absolutely no respect for privacy: the newspaper. And newspapers quickly discovered that ordinary people loved reading about royal scandals almost as much as royals loved creating them. A perfect historical partnership. For centuries, court gossip had mostly remained trapped inside palaces, whispered through corridors by nervous aristocrats in uncomfortable shoes. But now scandals travelled fast. A king could embarrass himself in Paris on Tuesday, and somebody in Vienna would be reading about it over breakfast by Friday, an exhausting development for monarchies everywhere. And unfortunately for royal mistresses, public opinion became increasingly important during this period. Kings were no longer just rulers. They were public figures, symbols, and when citizens already struggled with poverty, watching elderly monarchs shower diamonds onto glamorous companions became slightly less charming. Strange how that happens. One famous example appeared in Britain under Edward VII. Before becoming king, Edward spent decades as Prince of Wales waiting for his mother, Queen Victoria, to stop living forever. By the moment Edward finally inherited the throne, he was an elderly man with decades of experience in gambling, smoking, and romantic chaos. Among the most important women in his life was Alice Keppel. Alice was not merely beautiful, she possessed a remarkable calmness and understood Edward emotionally. Alice possessed a soothing effect on him. She could calm his temper and gently manage the chaos. Essentially, she became part companion, part therapist. Surprisingly, Edward's wife, Alexandra of Denmark, tolerated the relationship. As long as discretion existed publicly, everyone pretended not to notice the obvious. Still, Alice occupied a precarious position because Edward was aging rapidly, and unlike medieval mistresses, she now faced not only court politics but public scrutiny. Then, in 1910, Edward VII died. Alice reportedly left Buckingham Palace through a back entrance to avoid attention, a painfully symbolic exit. Former royal companions often discovered that influence vanished faster than affection. Political importance faded. New courts formed around new monarchs. Let's drift toward the Russian Empire. Under Nicholas II, mistress culture became less flamboyant. Nicholas was unusually devoted to his wife, Alexandra Feodorovna. But earlier, Russian courts, like Catherine the Great's, were different. Catherine herself was the ruler, allowing her the same romantic flexibility male monarchs enjoyed. Catherine often arranged comfortable retirements for former companions. Grigory Potemkin remained influential long after their romantic relationship evolved into partnership. Imperial affection moved quickly. Nowhere was this more visible than among minor royal courts in Germany, where everybody knew everybody, and scandal became claustrophobic. One strange phenomenon involved morganatic relationships, marriages where a king married beneath his rank, meaning the wife and children had no claim to the throne. As we move into the 20th century, royal mystique weakened. Kings and queens increasingly resembled celebrities, and royal mistresses became celebrity scandals. The clearest example is Wallis Simpson. She became the woman for whom Edward VIII gave up the throne entirely in 1936. British society reacted with horror. Edward ultimately abdicated. But abdication transformed them into permanent outsiders, neither fully royal nor fully ordinary, drifting through aristocratic Europe. After Edward died, Wallis became increasingly isolated. A woman once at the center of public fascination, reduced to quiet loneliness inside a Paris residence. This sad pattern repeated across Europe after World War I. Empires collapsed. The Russian, German, and Austrian courts dissolved almost overnight. Palaces emptied. Titles lost meaning. Women once attached to power became relics from extinct worlds, retelling stories about vanished etiquette and jewels. And perhaps that is the strangest thing about royal mistresses. For brief moments they stood closer to power than almost anyone alive. They witnessed rulers privately. One of the strangest things about royal history is how often people underestimated women who had already survived royal courts. If someone successfully navigated 20 years of palace intrigue without being poisoned, exiled or framed, they were likely the smartest person in the room. After the king died, certain mistresses didn't fade quietly. They adapted. They survived like emotionally exhausted foxes wandering through burning castles. While many depended on beauty early on, the women who lasted longest possessed something more dangerous: patience and observation. They understood who hated whom, which ministers lied, and which duchesses collected gossip like decorative porcelain. Let's look at Madame de Maintenon. Born into instability, she even spent part of her childhood in prison with her father. Quietly disciplined and controlled, she was the opposite of the glittering chaos at the court of Louis XIV. Maintenon offered stability to the aging king. Louis eventually traded fireworks for warm soup and emotional consistency. After Louis XIV died in 1715, she withdrew gracefully to the Maison Royale de Saint-Louis, an institution she had founded. The truly skilled survivors always understood timing. They knew when to speak, when to flatter, and when to vanish. Compare this with Barbara Villiers, mistress of Charles II. She was as subtle as a chandelier falling downstairs. She collected enemies aggressively and spent money extravagantly, believing that consequences were merely theoretical. After Charles died, her situation deteriorated. Society worshipped her in youth, but mocked her in age, a timelessly cruel pattern. Imagine spending decades inside the emotional center of a kingdom, then waking up one morning to complete silence. Lola Montez is another example. She wasn't actually Spanish. She was Irish, but she understood the power of performance. She captivated King Ludwig I of Bavaria, who showered her with titles, but the public reacted with horror and riots. Eventually, Ludwig abdicated, and Lola's world vanished. She survived by traveling and performing lectures, becoming mythological. In the 19th century, mistresses transformed into cultural celebrities. Financial independence mattered more than royal affection. No one demonstrated survival better than Camilla Parker Bowles. Her story unfolded under the glare of modern media. Camilla spent decades publicly mocked, yet she achieved what few managed: legitimacy and even queenship. These women saw the humans behind the crowns, kings frightened by illness, crying privately, or panicking about politics. The public saw crowns, but mistresses saw people. Next time we'll look at those who became more famous than the queens themselves. One of the more awkward realities of royal history is that sometimes the mistress won. Officially, the queen remained dignified, legitimate, crowned, painted into giant portraits beside velvet curtains and suspiciously sleepy dogs. But in public memory, in gossip, in literature, in sheer dramatic presence, sometimes the mistress completely overwhelmed the monarchy itself. And honestly, a surprising number of royal marriages operated less like romances and more like international trade agreements with embroidery. So while queens performed duty publicly, mistresses often occupied the emotional space beside the king privately. And that emotional proximity created powerful historical myths. Now perhaps no woman embodied this phenomenon more completely than Madame de Pompadour. Even today, centuries later, people remember Pompadour instantly. Meanwhile, many casual history fans struggle to name the actual queen beside her. Pompadour survived through usefulness. She understood art, politics, architecture, and above all, the king himself. She became a one-woman emotional support infrastructure for the French monarchy. But before the collapse arrived, another woman would inherit the strange burden of becoming the king's emotional refuge: Madame du Barry. poor du Barry. Following Madame de Pompadour at Versailles was probably like performing music after Mozart. Yet despite all the hatred surrounding her, du Barry became unforgettable. And this pattern repeated constantly across Europe. Queen Marie Leszczyńska, or Catherine of Braganza, remained far less vivid in popular culture. Because queenship often required restraint, mistresses could be colourful, and colourful people survive storytelling better. Take Diane de Poitiers and Catherine de Medici. Diane often overshadowed Catherine completely during the reign of Henry II. Henry used intertwined initials symbolizing their relationship. Centuries later, many people still find Diane more glamorous and memorable. History can be astonishingly unfair to competent women, especially queens forced into difficult political decisions. Then there is Nell Gwyn. Nell began as an orange seller and actress before becoming companion to Charles II. Unlike foreign-born queens often viewed with suspicion, Nell appeared unmistakably English, earthy, human. One generation painted these women as wicked seductresses, the next as tragic romantics. Rarely did anyone ask whether they were simply complicated people trapped inside bizarre systems. Many royal mistresses became historically immortal, precisely because their relationships were impossible. Behind every famous royal mistress stood an actual woman aging in real time, because kings always died eventually. And for the women beside them, the end usually arrived not with romance, but paperwork, shuttered apartments, the terrifying silence after years spent beside absolute power. By the middle of the 18th century, the position of royal mistress had become strangely professional, not respectable exactly, but organized. There were apartments, staff, jewelry allowances, political expectations, carefully timed entrances at court, and naturally endless gossip from people pretending to be morally shocked. France especially had turned the royal mistress into something close to an unofficial government office, which is honestly impressive in the worst possible way. After the death of a king, these women discovered a truth. Their entire existence had been built around one man. Once he disappeared, so did everything. Let's drift toward Jeanne Bécu, better known as Madame du Barry. She entered the court of Louis XV late in his life. Louis XV was once called Louis the Beloved. Unfortunately, the French population gradually changed their minds after decades of wars, debt, and scandals. The king was older and obsessed with avoiding unpleasant realities. He found comfort in a younger woman who made life feel softer. Classic royal behavior. Madame du Barry had risen from humble beginnings. This horrified the aristocracy. Versailles was essentially a glitter-covered swamp of affairs, vanity, and perfume. The nobles sneered at her background and speech, yet they still attended her parties and begged for favors. Human consistency remains history's weakest skill. Louis XV adored her anyway. He showered her with estates, diamonds, and influence. She floated through Versailles wrapped in silk and gold for several years. But then came 1774. Louis XV caught smallpox. The entire atmosphere changed. Royal mistresses existed only while the king existed. The moment his health failed, courtiers began backing away. She became inconvenient, embarrassing. The dying king was pressured to dismiss her before his death. Imagine spending years as the emotional center of someone's life, only to be politely removed from the building during their final illness. Madame du Barry was sent away. The new king, Louis XVI, had little interest in her. His queen, Marie Antoinette, disliked du Barry intensely. Versailles was crowded enough without her drama. Madame du Barry was exiled to a convent. Governments love solving political discomfort by placing women in convents until everyone calms down. She lived comfortably for some years after returning to private life. But the French Revolution was preparing itself. It was catastrophically unhealthy for royal luxury. During the Revolution, she tried to survive quietly. She sold jewelry, avoided politics, but her connections to the monarchy remained impossible to erase. Revolutionary France was suspicious of anyone who once owned curtains nicer than average. Eventually she was arrested, symbolizing a world they wanted to destroy. In 1793, Madame du Barry was executed by guillotine. Witnesses claimed she panicked terribly at the end, which feels painfully human. One of France's most glittering royal mistresses ended her life terrified beneath a machine designed to make death efficient, engineering and emotional catastrophe. While France specialized in dramatic endings, England preferred something quieter, usually sadder. Let's wander toward Barbara Villiers, mistress of Charles II. Charles II restored the English monarchy after years of civil war. He returned determined to enjoy everything, women especially. He collected mistresses with enthusiasm. Barbara Villiers was stunningly beautiful and politically aggressive. She openly fought with ministers, demanded titles. If the king loved you, rules became flexible. For a while, she lived magnificently. But royal affection shifts constantly, especially when attached to men who become distracted every 14 seconds. Charles II died in 1685. Unlike France, England did not immediately exile former mistresses. Barbara survived quite comfortably afterward, but survival is not relevance. The court moved on. Barbara aged. Her beauty faded. And slowly she became another aging woman wandering through the edges of a society that once revolved around her. Imagine living for decades inside the brightest room in Europe and then slowly realizing nobody turns toward you anymore. That transition was emotionally brutal. Not every mistress ended tragically. Take Nell Gwyn. She came from poverty, worked in theaters. She was an actress when actresses were considered scandalous. People adored her humor. Charles II genuinely loved her company because she made him laugh. This sounds healthier than most royal relationships. On his deathbed, Charles asked his brother not to let poor Nellie starve. Even kings understood retirement planning for mistresses was historically unreliable. Nell managed financial support and lived quietly before dying young. Compared to executions or debt, she achieved the royal mistress retirement package. Royal mistresses existed in a deeply unstable world. They could be richer than nobles and more famous than queens. But none of that power truly belonged to them. Power rested on affection, one of the least stable political systems. A king could promise devotion on Tuesday and acquire a new obsession by Thursday. After the king died, these women faced the question, who are you once the royal gaze moves away? For some, the answer was exile. For others, execution. Beneath the jewels and scandals, these women were simply trying to survive inside systems designed by powerful men. Systems that rewarded beauty briefly, then punished it permanently. And with that thought drifting through the candle smoke, let's slowly continue onward to another collection of royal catastrophes. One of the more dangerous side effects of becoming a royal mistress was the gradual loss of perspective. If a king spends years showering you with jewels, palaces, titles, and promises whispered after midnight banquets, you may think this arrangement could become permanent. History repeatedly shows this was usually a terrible idea, because monarchies loved mistresses right up until the moment those mistresses appeared too ambitious. Then suddenly everyone remembered tradition, morality, and the importance of social order. Convenient timing, really. Let's wander into the complicated life of Alice Perez. Alice appeared during the final years of Edward III of England. Edward III had once been energetic and successful, but by old age he had become exhausted, grieving, and increasingly isolated. His beloved queen, Philippa of Hainaut, had died. The king's health weakened. The court became tense. And into this atmosphere stepped Alice Perez. Nobody knows how charming she was, but she clearly possessed survival instincts powerful enough to thrive inside medieval politics. Alice gained extraordinary influence over the elderly king. Soon she controlled access to him, accumulated property, and appeared beside him constantly. This enraged the nobility. She was not royal, yet she had inserted herself into the centre of English power through proximity and persistence. Parliament accused her of corruption. One described her as manipulative and greedy, which also described approximately 80% of the medieval aristocracy. Alice lacked institutional protection. Her power depended entirely on Edward staying alive, which was unfortunate because Edward was extremely old. As the king declined, political enemies gathered around Alice like vultures. Once Edward III finally died in 1377, her collapse happened almost instantly. The new government charged her with theft. Her properties were seized. She was banished from court and treated like a suspicious thief. If medieval England punished ambitious mistresses harshly, Imperial Russia transformed the process into an Olympic sport. Let's look at Catherine Dolgorukov. Alexander II of Russia met Catherine when she was very young. Over time, the emperor became deeply attached to her, despite remaining married. Court society hated the relationship. Russian aristocrats enjoyed scandal the way cats enjoy knocking objects off tables. Alexander openly favored Catherine. After the empress finally died in 1880, Alexander married Catherine only weeks later. The marriage was morganatic, shocking the imperial family. Then history delivered a catastrophe. In 1881, Alexander II was assassinated. Catherine's entire world collapsed immediately. The new emperor deeply disliked her. The court froze her out socially. She eventually left Russia and lived mostly in exile abroad. Living inside memory was often the only kingdom left. Now let's drift toward Diane de Poitiers, who managed to stay elegant in the French court. She was 20 years older than Henry II, but Henry adored her, wearing her colours and trusting her judgment constantly. Meanwhile, his wife, Catherine de' Medici, watched with controlled fury. Diane gained enormous influence, even controlling patronage and magnificent estates. In 1559, Henry II suffered a horrific jousting accident. The instant he was gone, Catherine de' Medici unleashed decades of bottled resentment. Diane was ordered to return crown jewels and leave court. She became an elderly widow-like figure, quietly removed from the stage. Finally, Lola Montez captures the danger of becoming too important to a ruler. She was an Irish dancer who reinvented herself as a Spanish beauty. King Ludwig I of Bavaria became obsessed with her. But Lola possessed the subtlety of a cannon, insulting officials and picking fights constantly. Eventually, the pressure became unbearable. Ludwig was forced to abdicate, and Lola fled Bavaria almost immediately. Royal favor is temporary. Once the king vanished, society treated these women like embarrassing leftovers from a previous administration. They spent their final years in convents or exile, surrounded by fading portraits of happier decades, no longer central to the story. One of the strangest things about royal history is how quickly entire worlds can disappear. A king dies, a revolution begins, a palace empties, and suddenly people who once dined beneath gold ceilings are trying to figure out where exactly they left their savings. Royal mistresses often experience this collapse more intensely than almost anyone else, because unlike queens, they rarely possessed legal stability. And unlike ordinary nobles, they depended heavily on personal favor rather than inherited systems. So when dynasties crumbled, these women frequently found themselves floating awkwardly through the wreckage of old regimes, still elegant, still famous, but emotionally stranded between two worlds. Let's slowly move toward one of the most extraordinary survivors in royal history, Madame de Maintenon. Now, technically, Madame de Maintenon became more than a mistress. Possibly. Probably. Royal marriages in 17th century France sometimes operated like classified government secrets wrapped in lace. After the death of Queen Maria Theresa, many historians believe Louis XIV of France secretly married Maintenon in a private ceremony. But because the marriage was likely morganatic and politically inconvenient, she never became queen officially, which meant she occupied one of the oddest positions imaginable. Not exactly wife, not exactly mistress, more like a permanent emotional advisor, living inside Versailles while everyone politely avoided defining the relationship too clearly. Maintenon herself was very different from earlier royal favorites. She was calm, religious, intelligent, and astonishingly disciplined. This was a court where people literally watched the king wake up in the morning as part of official ceremony. Louis XIV trusted Maintenon deeply, especially during his later years, when age and endless wars began wearing down the once dazzling Sun King. She encouraged greater religious seriousness at court, less gambling, more restraint. Naturally, many nobles hated this immediately. Versailles preferred its scandals properly lubricated with champagne and emotional instability. Still, Maintenon survived where many mistresses failed because she avoided obvious arrogance. She understood something crucial: visibility could destroy you. And when Louis XIV finally died in 1715, Maintenon faced the same dangerous transition all royal companions eventually confronted: life after the king. Except in her case, the outcome was surprisingly peaceful. She quietly retired to a religious school she had founded years earlier. She spent her final years in relative calm, surrounded by education and prayer rather than palace gossip. Now, unfortunately, most stories were less serene. Let's drift toward Maria Fitzherbert. The future George IV of the United Kingdom fell deeply in love with Maria Fitzherbert in the 1780s. There was one enormous problem. Maria was Catholic. She was widowed. And under British law, the prince could not legally marry a Catholic without losing succession rights. So naturally, he secretly married her anyway, because royal men throughout history have consistently treated constitutional law as a mildly annoying suggestion. The marriage was legally invalid, politically impossible, and emotionally very real. George adored Maria sincerely, at least by his standards. Imagine a peacock somehow becoming king. That was George IV. Over time, political pressure forced him into official dynastic marriage elsewhere. When George eventually died in 1830, Maria lost the fragile protection his affection had provided. George himself reportedly asked for a miniature portrait of her on his deathbed, which is oddly tender beneath all the constitutional chaos. Now let's gently wander into imperial China for a moment. The Forbidden City specialized in a far more structured version. The fate of their consorts varied enormously. One of the most remarkable examples was Empress Dowager Cixi. Cixi began as a lower-ranking concubine. She knew that survival inside palace politics required the emotional caution of handling explosives with chopsticks. When the Xianfeng Emperor died in 1861, China faced political uncertainty. Cixi proved astonishingly skilled at navigating power. She did not fade after the emperor died. She became more powerful. For nearly half a century, Cixi influenced Chinese politics enormously. Still, even Cixi's story carried loneliness beneath the grandeur. Imperial life remained heavily ritualized and isolated. And there is something deeply haunting about an aging former concubine sitting inside enormous palace halls while the ancient world around her slowly cracks apart. Now let's float back toward Europe one final time. The 19th century created a new category, the celebrity companion, Lily Langtry. Lily Langtry became famous for beauty so extreme, Victorian society essentially lost its collective mind. Naturally, Edward VII became romantically involved with her. Lily, however, handled royal attention more cleverly. She built an independent public identity, acting, performing, managing finances. Unlike earlier mistresses trapped entirely inside palace structures, women like Langtry could survive socially through fame itself. Still, for centuries, royal mistresses existed inside a deeply fragile arrangement, loved privately, judged publicly, rewarded extravagantly, discarded efficiently, and after the king died, many faced a terrifying silence. No more invitations, no more ceremonies, just long corridors of memory filled with fading music and portraits of men who once promised permanence. Kings could command armies, build palaces, but even they could not preserve the worlds they created around desire. Eventually, every court ball ended, every candle burned low, every favorite aged, and history moved on. So as another royal palace grows quiet around us tonight, let's continue drifting through the strange afterlives of those who stood closest to power. By now, a pattern has probably started settling gently into the background, like soft rain against old castle windows. A king dies. The mistress loses protection, the court pretends she never mattered, and everyone moves on while keeping the gossip alive. But not every royal mistress accepted disappearance so politely. Some fought, some manipulated, some reinvented themselves with astonishing determination. Let's begin with Madame de Montespan. Montespan approached court life with the subtlety of fireworks exploding inside a cathedral. She was witty, brilliant, beautiful, and completely aware of her own power. Louis XIV of France became utterly captivated by her magnificence. This was peak Versailles, peak wigs, fountains, and gold-covered overconfidence. The Sun King adored spectacle, and Montespan fit beautifully into that environment. But Montespan was already married. Her husband reportedly drove through Paris with giant antlers on his carriage to mock his own humiliation. Then came the affair of the poisons. Chaos involving fortune-tellers, poison sellers, and enough paranoia to make everyone uncomfortable around soup. Louis XIV eventually distanced himself, and his attention shifted toward the calmer, more respectable Madame de Maintenon. While Montespan faded, another mistress turned survival into art. Madame de Pompadour understood something essential. Beauty fades. Influence must evolve. She became advisor, cultural patron, and political intermediary. She worked harder than half the government, and Louis XV trusted her deeply. But power creates enemies. Nobles sneered behind fans, and Pompadour's health deteriorated from the exhausting duties of court life. Now, let's wander toward Caroline Lamb. She became obsessed with Lord Byron, describing him as mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Lord Byron was the celebrity prince of scandalous behavior. Their affair exploded through London society with public drama and emotional meltdowns. Perhaps the most extraordinary woman was La Malinche. She became interpreter, advisor, and companion to Hernán Cortés during the conquest of Mexico. She spoke multiple languages and played a critical role in negotiations. Without her, Cortés would have struggled enormously. Royal mistresses were intelligent survivors in systems where emotional attachment was currency and security could evaporate overnight. As the ballroom empties, we see how fragile power really is when it depends on being loved tomorrow as much as yesterday. As the centuries drifted forward, the world slowly changed around royal mistresses. Monarchies weakened, revolutions arrived, newspapers replaced whispered court gossip, and eventually entire royal systems began looking slightly ridiculous to ordinary people trying to survive industrial cities and modern wars. But for a very long time, the fate of royal mistresses remained strangely similar. They lived inside beautiful cages built from affection. And affection, unfortunately, is one of the least reliable building materials in human history. Tonight, we've wandered through women who ruled palaces unofficially, women who wore diamonds larger than medical ethics would probably recommend, women who advised kings, manipulated courts, survived revolutions, and occasionally terrified entire governments simply by being emotionally important to the wrong man. And yet most of them shared the same ending. Not death necessarily, not even disgrace, just fading, quietly, slowly, like music ending in another room. Let's rest for a moment with one final story. Countess Virginia Aldwini was one of the great beauties of 19th century Europe. She became involved with Napoleon III during the glittering artificial elegance of the Second French Empire. Now Napoleon III himself was a fascinatingly awkward emperor. He spent years in exile attempting failed coups before somehow becoming ruler of France anyway. The Countess of Castiglione arrived in Paris officially to support Italian political interests. Unofficially, she also arrived looking like someone engineered to ruin diplomatic concentration. The emperor became enchanted. Naturally, courts always reacted to beautiful women with the emotional stability of startled pigeons. The Countess quickly became famous across Europe. Painters adored her. Photographers obsessed over her image. And unlike many earlier royal mistresses, she understood celebrity itself as power. But beauty creates its own trap. As years passed, the Countess became increasingly obsessed with preserving her appearance. She withdrew socially, avoided daylight, refused many visitors, and spent enormous amounts of time staring at old photographs of herself. A woman once celebrated across Europe, eventually hiding from age itself inside darkened rooms, not because she lost intelligence or worth, but because society had taught her beauty was the center of her existence. And royal mistresses learned this lesson more harshly than most. Their value was often measured visually, youthfully, temporarily. Now by the 20th century, the classic royal mistress had begun fading alongside old monarchy itself. Kings lost power, courts lost mystery. Still, echoes of the old system survived. Even modern royal scandals follow remarkably ancient patterns, and perhaps the strangest part of all these stories is how rarely the kings themselves suffered equally. Meanwhile, the women around him became cautionary tales, temptresses, manipulators, gold diggers, seductresses. Many royal mistresses were remarkably capable women trapped inside narrow systems. Some became skilled politicians. Some acted as diplomats. Imagine entering court as a teenager, living constantly watched, competing against rivals, trying to secure your future in a world where one illness, one new favorite, or one royal funeral could destroy everything overnight. Because for many mistresses, trust became nearly impossible. Courtiers lied constantly, allies disappeared quickly, and yet, despite everything, some of these relationships were real, messy, imperfect, unequal, but real. Kings mourned certain mistresses deeply, wrote letters obsessively, kept portraits beside their beds, whispered final requests for beloved companions while dying beneath layers of ceremonial fabric and medical incompetence. Eventually, politics entered the room wearing expensive shoes, and so the mistresses drifted through history. Some retired quietly to estates. Some vanished into convents smelling faintly of candle wax and resignation. Some lost fortunes. But nearly all discovered the same hard truth eventually. Royal favor is temporary. Courts are fickle. So perhaps tonight, as we leave these corridors of velvet and jealousy, we can feel sympathy for the women history reduced to footnotes. They were survivors of one of the strangest professions humanity ever invented. The royal mistress. One moment you dined beside kings beneath chandeliers, and the next you were another aging figure staring quietly out a palace window. So dim the candles a little lower. Let the palace doors close softly behind us, and drift off knowing that somewhere in history another exhausted courtier is still carrying love letters down an impossibly long hallway. Good night. Executioners in the Middle Ages lived in a strange space. Not quite criminals, not quite respectable citizens either, somewhere in between, like a necessary inconvenience that everyone pretended not to see. You might imagine them as dramatic figures, hooded, looming, always surrounded by fear. But the reality was much quieter, much more awkward, and in many ways deeply lonely, because while everyone needed an executioner, no one actually wanted to know one. Let's begin with a simple truth. In medieval Europe, executioners were essential. Laws were harsh, punishments were public, and someone had to carry them out. Kings could sign orders. Judges could pass sentences. But at the end of the day, someone had to stand there with an axe and follow through. And that someone quickly became socially untouchable. Executioners were often treated as outcasts, not officially banished, just quietly avoided, which is sometimes worse. People wouldn't sit next to them at taverns, wouldn't invite them into their homes, wouldn't marry into their families. If an executioner walked into a marketplace, you might notice a small ripple, a subtle shifting away. Nothing dramatic, just enough to remind him exactly where he stood. And yet, interestingly, everyone still relied on him. If a criminal needed to be punished, the executioner was suddenly very important. Officials would speak to him, give him instructions, even show him a bit of respect, temporarily. Then, once the job was done, things would return to normal, which is to say, everyone went back to ignoring him. This created a very odd social rhythm. One day you're central to the justice system. The next, you're not allowed to buy bread without someone placing it on the counter from a safe distance. And yes, that actually happened. In some towns, executioners were not allowed to touch goods directly. Shopkeepers would set items down, take payment without contact, and avoid eye contact if possible. It wasn't written law in most places, just custom. The kind of custom that's very hard to argue with, because arguing with it would mean acknowledging the executioner as a normal member of society. And that was clearly not going to happen. Now, you might wonder how someone even became an executioner in the first place. Well, it wasn't exactly a dream job. Most executioners didn't choose the role out of passion. There was no childhood moment of inspiration. No young boy thinking, one day, I too will stand in a public square holding a very large axe. More often, the job was inherited. If your father was an executioner, chances were you would be one too. This created entire family lines of executioners, generations of people doing the same work, living in the same social isolation, passing down not just the skills, but the stigma. And the skills were important, because despite what you might think, execution wasn't supposed to be messy. A good executioner was valued for precision, clean, efficient, controlled. One swing, that was the goal. If it took two, people noticed. If it took three, well, let's just say the crowd's mood could shift very quickly. So executioners trained, carefully, repeatedly. They practiced on animals, on objects, sometimes on already dead bodies. The goal was muscle memory, consistency, the ability to perform under pressure while an entire town watched in complete silence. No pressure at all. And when things went wrong, which they sometimes did, the consequences were not just technical, they were social. A botched execution could damage an executioner's reputation permanently. People would talk, quietly of course, but persistently. And in a world where your job already made you an outsider, losing professional respect made things even more uncomfortable. So there was a strange kind of pride in doing the job well. Not pride in the act itself necessarily, but in the skill, in the control, in the ability to carry out something unpleasant with a certain level of competence, which, oddly enough, made executioners some of the most technically skilled individuals in medieval towns. Not exactly the kind of expertise you brag about at dinner parties, if you were invited to dinner parties, which you were not. Now, despite their social isolation, executioners did have a few advantages. Because people didn't want to interact with them, they were often given special permissions. They could live on the edge of town, sometimes in relatively large houses. They might receive higher pay than average laborers. And interestingly, they often had access to things others didn't. For example, the clothes of executed criminals. Yes, that was part of the job. After an execution, the belongings of the condemned, clothing, shoes, sometimes personal items, would often go to the executioner. It was considered part of their compensation, which meant executioners sometimes wore surprisingly good clothes. Second-hand, of course. But in a time when clothing was expensive, this could be quite valuable, though it did come with a certain association. You might be wearing a very fine coat, but everyone knew where it came from, which probably limited the number of compliments you received. Another unexpected role executioners often played was medical. Not officially trained doctors, of course, but they had experience with the human body. They understood anatomy in a very practical way, and in some regions they were allowed to perform minor medical procedures. Things like setting bones, treating wounds, even preparing certain remedies, which created a slightly ironic situation. The same person you avoided in public might also be the one you quietly visited when you needed help, preferably at night, preferably without anyone seeing, because nothing says social contradiction quite like sneaking over to the executioner's house for medical advice. And speaking of houses, let's take a moment to imagine what daily life looked like. It was calm, surprisingly calm. Executioners didn't perform executions every day. In many towns, executions were relatively rare events, so most days were spent doing ordinary things, maintaining tools, managing household tasks, perhaps tending a small garden. A quiet life, just on the edges of everything. Children of executioners grew up in this environment, aware from a young age that they were different, that other children might not want to play with them, that their family name carried a certain weight, and that their future was, more or less, already decided. Because leaving the profession was extremely difficult. Even if an executioner wanted to change his life, society didn't make it easy. Other professions were closed off. Guilds wouldn't accept him. Communities wouldn't fully trust him, so the role continued. Passed down, maintained, quietly persistent, and there's something almost melancholic about that. Not dramatic, not tragic in a loud way. Just a steady, ongoing separation from the rest of society. A life lived nearby, but never quite included. Of course, not all executioners were the same. Some embraced their role, developed a kind of detached professionalism. Others struggled with it. We don't have detailed personal diaries from most of them, but the patterns are clear. This was not a glamorous life. It was a necessary one, and necessity, as it turns out, doesn't always come with comfort. Now, as we continue drifting through this quiet corner of medieval life, we'll start to meet a few specific executioners, real individuals, with names, reputations, and occasionally surprisingly complex personalities. Because even within this strange profession, there were degrees of skill, of character, and of, well, human oddness. And some of them became quite famous, which for an executioner is both impressive and slightly concerning. So let's slowly move forward into the lives of those who stood a little more prominently in this already very unusual role. Would you like me to continue with part 2, focusing on famous executioners and their oddly detailed reputations? If the first part was about the strange quiet of the profession, this part is about the rare executioners whose names actually survived. Most medieval executioners vanished into the general fog of history, which, to be fair, was a common fate for almost everyone. But a few became known by name, and once that happened, their lives became even more awkward than usual. Their work was still feared, still necessary, and still followed by the usual social cold shoulder. One of the most famous executioners in medieval and early modern Europe was Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg, though he lived a little later than the strict Middle Ages. He was not a faceless brute, which is what people often imagine. He kept detailed records of his life and work, and those records show a man trying very hard to be competent, orderly, and respectable in a profession that society found deeply unrespectable. He carried out executions, yes, but he also worked as a healer and maintained a diary of his duties, which is the sort of thing that makes historians sit up a little straighter in their chairs. Schmidt's life reminds us that executioners were often skilled officials rather than wild-eyed monsters from a storybook. They were expected to know procedure, timing, and technique. A clean execution was considered better than a clumsy one, because even in a world with very harsh justice, people still cared about form. Medieval and early modern communities could be extremely rigid about punishment, but they also liked things done properly. Of course they did. A society can be horrified and bureaucratic at the same time. Another famous name was Henker, a term used in German-speaking lands for executioners more generally, though not always as a personal name. These men were often part of hereditary lines, and the job could become a family identity as much as a profession. That meant children grew up knowing exactly what the outside world thought of them. They lived with the odd contradiction of being needed by everyone and welcomed by almost no one. It's a social arrangement that sounds exhausting because it was. Executioners sometimes had to handle more than capital punishment. They might supervise torture, manage prison discipline, or perform tasks that others refused to do. In some places they also had to dispose of animal carcasses, clean streets after public punishments, or deal with the bodies of the dead in ways polite society would rather not discuss over supper. So yes, they were part official functionary, part social exile, and part unpleasant municipal problem solver. A charming career path, all things considered. The interesting part is that their isolation was not always absolute. Some towns paid executioners well enough to keep them from starving, and some authorities gave them housing or small privileges. That did not make them respected exactly, but it did make them useful enough to tolerate. Medieval society had many categories for people, and necessary but awkward was one of the most important. Their marriages were also complicated. Because many people refused to marry into executioner families, the profession often stayed inside a narrow social circle. That created communities of outsiders, where one executioner's son married another executioner's daughter, and the whole arrangement kept turning inward, because the outside world kept turning them away. It wasn't romance in the fairy tale sense. It was more like social plumbing, except sadder. And yet these families could be remarkably stable. When a profession is inherited, people learn its customs early. Tools, duties, reputations, and survival strategies all pass from parent to child. A boy growing up in an executioner's house might learn to sharpen blades, keep accounts, and understand exactly how carefully one had to move through town. There was probably very little room for rebellion. I want to be a baker sounds less like a dream and more like a public relations disaster when everyone already knows your surname. What made these men especially interesting to later historians is that they stood at the intersection of power and shame. They represented the state's authority, but they were not allowed to share in the state's dignity. They enforced order while being denied belonging. That makes them one of the more quietly tragic figures in medieval life, though they are rarely treated that way in popular stories. People like a dramatic villain. The reality was usually a man with a job nobody else wanted, and a town that preferred not to think too closely about who actually carried it out. And that brings us to the daily rhythm of the executioner's life, which was far less theatrical than fiction suggests. Most days were probably tedious, waiting, maintaining equipment, handling paperwork, maybe being stared at in the street. There's something almost comic about the fact that a man could be feared for what he might do on one particular morning, and then spend the rest of the month sitting around wondering whether anyone would sell him decent bread. So when people ask how executioners lived in the Middle Ages, the answer is not just with a hood and an axe. It is with inherited stigma, practical skill, limited company, and a weirdly official kind of loneliness. They lived on the edge of society, and society, in return, depended on them while pretending not to. That's the strange little trap of the profession. Everyone wanted punishment to happen. Nobody wanted to meet the person assigned to do it. By the later Middle Ages, the executioner's home was often a place people knew about, but tried not to approach too closely. It might sit on the outskirts of town, near the wall, near the gate, or just far enough away that respectable citizens could pretend it was somebody else's problem. The house itself was not always miserable. In some places, executioners were paid well enough to live in relative comfort. But comfort did not equal acceptance, and that was the whole point of the arrangement. Inside, the house was likely practical rather than cozy in the modern sense. Work tools needed storage, clothing had to be kept in order, families had to eat, children had to be raised, and life had to continue whether the neighbors approved or not. The executioner's household was often a household of uneasy normality. Bread was baked, laundry was done. Someone probably complained about the weather. The usual domestic drama, just with the slightly less usual detail that one member of the family might be expected to put on special clothes and head into the town square when ordered. There was also the matter of reputation, which followed the family like a smell nobody admitted noticing. Children of executioners often inherited not just the work, but the social burden. They might be shunned by other children, denied apprenticeships, or treated as permanently suspicious. And because medieval society loved categories almost as much as it loved punishment, that stigma could become very hard to escape. Still, executioner families adapted. They formed their own circles. They married within narrow networks. They learned which officials were polite, which priests were practical, and which neighbors were willing to pretend things were normal if everyone kept their voices down. This was survival through careful negotiation, not glamorous but effective. In some regions, executioners also had a hand in dealing with torture. That sounds especially grim, but the medieval justice system often blurred the line between punishment, interrogation, and spectacle. The executioner was sometimes the man who tightened the rope, adjusted the device, or performed the physical acts ordered by the authorities. He was not necessarily the one making policy. He was the one implementing it, which is its own very specific kind of burden. And because they worked so closely with law enforcement, executioners were often oddly knowledgeable about crime. They knew offenders, judges, and punishments. They knew which sentences were common, which were symbolic, and which were meant to make a point. In some places, they even became useful informants or assistants in administrative matters. That gave them a strange kind of local intelligence, although it did not exactly improve their social life. There is something almost theatrical about the public execution itself, but the executioner's life before and after the event was usually plain. Waiting around, preparing, and then returning home to a neighborhood that did not invite him to dinner. The public hated the man and relied on him in equal measure, which is one of history's more consistent little hypocrisies. A lot of this dislike was moral, but some of it was almost superstition. People associated executioners with death, impurity, and bad luck. They might avoid touching them, refuse food they had handled, or keep them at a distance during ordinary interactions. This was not always logical, which is fine, because many medieval social rules were not designed to be logical. They were designed to keep boundaries firm and discomfort visible. And if we look at the broader picture, Executioners reveal something important about medieval life. The people who enforced harsh systems were often themselves trapped in one. They were not rulers. They were not nobles. They were workers whose labor made the machinery of justice visible. Then, once the machinery had turned, they were expected to vanish back into obscurity. That is probably the most medieval part of all. Not the axe, not the crowd, not even the sentence. It is the system that needs someone, relies on him, and then acts offended by his existence. So the executioner lived there, at the edge of town, in the middle of contradiction. A man of skill, a man of stigma, a man who could be indispensable on one day and unwelcome on the next. A family profession built on necessity, inheritance, and a great deal of social silence. And that silence, in its own way, was the loudest part of the job. An executioner's work depended on tools, and those tools were treated with a kind of grim respect. Not admiration exactly. More like the respect people reserve for things they are deeply uncomfortable with, but still insist on keeping polished. The axe was the most iconic instrument, but it was not the only one. Depending on the region and the sentence, executioners might use swords, ropes, wedges, hammers, or other devices that make the medieval world feel even more committed to unpleasant practicality. The axe, in particular, carried a certain ceremonial weight. It was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of lawful force. A well-made executioner's axe needed balance, sharpness, and control. The man using it had to know exactly how to place the blow. This was not a matter of brute strength. It was technique. And in a time when public punishment was watched closely, technique mattered a great deal. Some regions preferred the sword for beheadings, especially for people of higher status. This was partly because swords seemed less crude, and partly because elites liked their suffering with a little more dignity, because of course they did. Even at the edge of death, social rank found a way to stay in the room. Rope was another standard tool, especially for hanging. In some cases, the executioner had to calculate length, weight, and the angle of the drop. That sounds technical because the aim was not simply to kill, it was to do it in a way that conformed to local expectations. Public punishment was about law, yes, but also about display. Everything had to look right. Medieval justice was not known for gentleness, but it did care very much about presentation. Executioners also maintained their own private equipment, which could include knives, cords, restraining devices, and cleaning tools. There is something very plain and administrative about all that, which only makes it more eerie in retrospect. The job required preparation, maintenance, and planning. It was not a spontaneous act, it was a procedure. And procedures, as always, were where things could go badly if the person in charge was careless. That is why executioners trained. Repetition was part of the job. A clean swing, a steady hand, a sense of timing. These were practical skills, and like most practical skills, they were learned the hard way. Mistakes were remembered. The crowd was there to make sure of that. Sometimes executioners were also responsible for torturous equipment, which had its own set of technical requirements. Pulleys, racks, cords, restraints. Medieval authorities might order the punishment, but the executioner often had to understand how the mechanism worked. That made him not just an enforcer, but an operator, an unpleasant sort of specialist. There were also small, everyday tools that mattered more than they sound. Brushes, buckets, cloths, oil, whetstones, soap when it could be had. The executioner's life involved a lot of cleaning, because after the public drama was over, someone still had to put everything away, which is a nice reminder that every grand medieval spectacle eventually became housekeeping. In some places, executioners were also expected to dispose of body parts or manage burials. Again, not glorious work, but medieval cities had to handle death somehow, and the task often fell to the same socially marginal people assigned to punish it. There is a sort of administrative poetry in that, if your standards for poetry are sufficiently grim. What stands out most is how normal the routine may have felt to the people doing it. To the modern mind, the profession seems extreme. To the medieval city, it was simply part of how order was maintained. The executioner's tools were as real and ordinary to him as a baker's oven or a blacksmith's hammer. The difference, of course, was that nobody minded if the baker came to church. Still, tools alone do not make a profession. Reputation does a lot of the work, especially in a world where everyone knows everyone. The executioner's tools marked him as different, but so did his habits, his house, his family, and the way people treated him in the street. The axe was only the most visible part of a much larger social identity. So when we think of an executioner, we should not picture only the moment of action. We should picture the hours before it, the sharpening, the waiting, the careful handling, the quiet life behind the public one. A man with implements, instructions, and a neighborhood that would rather he remained at a polite distance. And that distance, more than the tools, defined the life. The executioner's most visible moments happened in the public square, but those moments were also the least typical parts of his life. For most of the year there was no crowd, no platform, no last speech. Just a town going about its business, and an executioner going about his own, quietly. The spectacle of punishment was memorable, but it was not the whole story. The rest of the story was waiting, routine, and the slow, unremarkable rhythm of daily obligations. When an execution was scheduled, the town would shift into a different mood. Officials would prepare documents. Guards would patrol more visibly. Spectators would gather. The condemned person would be brought out, and the executioner would do his job under the weight of all those eyes. That pressure was real, even if it was not always acknowledged. A mistake in front of everyone was a mistake that could follow a man for years. He carried not only the axe, but a very specific kind of responsibility. Yet, executioners were not usually the ones making moral judgments. They enforced decisions that had already been made by judges, magistrates, or rulers. Their role was to carry out sentences, not to debate them. That distinction did not make the job comfortable, but it did simplify it in a practical sense. Someone else had chosen the punishment. The executioner just had to perform it without breaking the rules too obviously. The public square in this way was a kind of stage. It had an audience, a script, and a strict set of expectations. The crowd wanted punishment, but it also wanted competence. A botched execution could shift the mood from grim satisfaction to uneasy discomfort. People liked their justice harsh, but they also liked it tidy. That tension made the executioner's work a little more complicated than it first appears. And after it was over, the square would empty. The officials would return to their offices. The crowd would go home. The body would be dealt with, one way or another. The executioner would return to the edge of town, to his house, to the same quiet life that had been waiting for him. The dramatic moment would become a memory, and the rest of the life would go on, almost as if nothing had happened. That contrast is one of the most interesting things about the profession. The split between public duty and private routine. The way a single morning could be filled with noise, attention, and tension, and then the rest of the week could be filled with bread, weather, and chores. The executioner's life had peaks, but they were rare and sharp. The rest of the time was flat, like most medieval lives. Private life for him was also constrained. He could not easily move through society as others did. He could not casually join a guild, start a new business, or expect a warm welcome at a wedding. His status followed him, and people knew where he stood. That made personal choices limited. Marriage, friendship, simple conversation. All of these were shaped by the fact that he was an executioner. Still, executions were not the only thing he did. He might also assist in local policing, manage prisoners, or help with bodily discipline. These tasks were less showy, but they kept him in the background machinery of the town. He was not only the man at the end of sentences, He was also the man who helped keep the system running, quietly and without applause. The public square, then, was just one room in a much larger, quieter house. The executioner's life was shaped by that square, but it was also shaped by the margins of the town, the edge of the market, the front steps of his own home. The drama of the spectacle was intermittent. The drama of the stigma was constant. And that is perhaps the most medieval part of it all. The way a society could gather to watch a punishment, then scatter, then pretend that the man who carried it out had never really been there. The executioner in this system was both essential and disposable, very present when needed, very easy to forget when not. So the life of the medieval executioner lived in that gap, between the moment of the blow and the rest of the day, between the crowd's attention and the town's quiet distance, between what had to be done and the person who had to do it while everyone looked away. Executioners, like everyone else, grew older. Their bodies slowed down. Their hands, once steady enough for one clean swing, might start to shake. Knives needed sharpening more often. Chores took longer. The edge of town did not get closer, but the town itself might feel smaller, more familiar, more tired. The work that had once felt heavy could, over time, start to feel routine in a different way. Less shocking, more exhausting. Some executioners carried on until they could no longer lift the axe. Some passed the work to a son or another apprentice. In a strange way, that passing on was almost like a family trade, except with a darker inheritance. The tools, the house, the reputation, the social distance, all of it moved down a generation. The next man took over the same odd combination of authority and exclusion, the same mix of respect and avoidance. And when the older executioner finally stepped away, there was no grand retirement, no ceremony, no village elder being honored for his service. He simply faded into the background of his own life, quietly finishing what years remained. The town did not suddenly decide to like him. The neighbors did not suddenly start inviting him to their tables. The reputation did not soften because he had put down the axe. Stigma, once it takes root, rarely loosens its grip. Death, in the end, came to executioners like it came to everybody else, without fanfare, without ceremony, and without much distinction. The man who had once stood at the center of a public square, surrounded by voices and tension, likely died in a small room, in relative quiet. The same streets that had watched him at work would barely notice when he was gone. The same crowd that had relied on his skill would forget his name faster than it remembered his face. There is something almost poetic about that, if the kind of poetry you enjoy is the kind that goes unnoticed. The executioner's life was built on contradiction. He was necessary and unwelcome. He was powerful in one narrow sense, yet powerless in almost every other. He enforced the law, but he was not allowed to be fully part of the community that lived under it. His job was to make the consequences of wrongdoing visible, while his own life remained quietly hidden on the edge of town. And so, when his story ends, it ends not with a final swing of the axe, but with the slow settling of ordinary time. The house on the outskirts goes on. The tools are polished one last time and then passed to another hand. The town moves forward, as towns do, carrying its memories and its habits without much fanfare. The executioner becomes a name in a ledger, a note in a record, a small footnote in the story of how medieval society managed its need for punishment and its instinctive discomfort with the man who did it. In the end, the life of the medieval executioner is not a story of drama or horror. It is a story of contradiction, of isolation, of quiet persistence, a profession that no one wanted, yet everyone required. A man who stood in the middle of public order, yet lived on its margins. A life that was essential, awkward, and strangely invisible all at once. And that, perhaps, is the calm, slightly melancholy ending the topic deserves. A fade-out, not a climax. Just the quiet acknowledgement that someone had to do the job, and that someone lived with it for a very long time, Royal families in the ancient world were not, as some might think, a collection of glamorous, perfectly preserved individuals posing for immortality. They were messy, chaotic, and full of people who never really mattered in the grand story. The forgotten children of ancient royal families are those who appear in records only once or twice, then vanish into the background noise of history. They were cousins, half-siblings, nephews and nieces who did not inherit thrones, did not lead wars, and did not get their names written in the big books. They were just there. It is easy to imagine royal children as pampered, fussed over, and surrounded by tutors and attendants. And in some ways they were. But in the ancient world, royal childhood was also fragile, conditional, and often very short. The fact that a child was born into a royal family did not automatically mean they would grow up. Infant mortality was high everywhere, and among elites it was only slightly less brutal, not kind. The difference was that when a royal child died, someone bothered to write it down. Sometimes. The forgotten royal children of antiquity are not the ones with famous titles. They are the ones whose names are tucked away in inscriptions, scattered across papyrus, or mentioned in passing as son of, daughter of, or half-brother of. These fragments are the only traces they left. They did not get statues, temples, or chronicles. They got a line at most. In the ancient Near East, for example, royal families often had many children, both legitimate and not. A king might have numerous wives, concubines, and temporary partners. The result was a sprawling network of siblings, cousins, and half-relatives. Some of these children were given minor roles in administration or temple life. Some were used as political pawns in marriages. Some simply disappeared, forgotten but not absent. In Egypt, the pharaohs were supposed to embody perfection, stability, and cosmic order, but their families were anything but orderly. Papyri and tomb inscriptions reveal a long list of obscure princes and princesses who never ruled, never rebelled, and never made it into the main narrative. They were brides for foreign kings, or brides for priests, or brides for nobody in particular. Their names appear in lists of children of the king, and then they vanish. The royal family tree is full of these ghostly branches. Ancient Greece, despite its reputation for philosophy and drama, was also full of royals and quasi-royals whose children were treated as background characters. In the smaller Greek kingdoms and tyrannies, the children of rulers were often shuffled off to allies, used as hostages, or quietly sidelined if they posed even the faintest threat to the main heir. Some of these children appear in Athenian records only as given in marriage to so-and-so, or sent to the court of such and such a king. No personality. No quotes, just a sentence. Persia, with its sprawling Achaemenid court, is another rich source of forgotten royal children. The Persian kings had many wives and many children, and the court was full of young princes and princesses who were never meant to rule. Some of them were given minor governorships. Some were used as hostages in diplomatic arrangements. Some were quietly removed from succession if they seemed too ambitious. The royal family, there was a delicate balancing act, and the children who did not fit into the final arrangement were gently erased from the main story. China, in the early imperial period, followed a similar pattern. Emperor after emperor tried to secure the succession by producing many sons, but that only made the problem more complicated. Dozens of princes were born, raised, and then either ignored, sidelined, or eliminated. The forgotten royal children of ancient China were not all tragic, but many of them were inconvenient. They existed, but they were never meant to be important. Their names appear in dynastic records as Prince so-and-so, followed by a brief note that he died young or died without issue. That is all they get. And then there is Rome, where the early imperial family turned dynastic machinery into an art form. The children of emperors and their relatives were often used as political tools, bred for alliances, or quietly disappeared if they threatened the main line. Some of these children are mentioned only once in the works of a historian, then never again. They were born, they were recorded, and then they faded into the margins of the empire. So the forgotten royal children of antiquity share a quiet, almost invisible fate. They were born into power, but not into the center of it. They were surrounded by luxury, but not by lasting attention. They experienced the privileges of the palace, but also its cold practicality. The royal family needed them sometimes, but never for very long. And this is where the irony of ancient royalty becomes clear. The families that tried so hard to preserve their bloodlines often treated many of their own children as disposable. Sons were married off, daughters were exchanged, and extras were quietly set aside. The forgotten children are the evidence of this pattern. They are the ones who were never meant to be remembered, but who still existed long enough to be mentioned once. So as we move forward, we will meet a few of these forgotten royal children by name, by fragment, and by the quiet traces they left behind. They will not be the heroes of the story. They will be the background figures, the almost visible silhouettes, the ones whose lives remind us that even in the glitter of ancient courts, not every royal child got a spotlight. The forgotten children of ancient royal families often appear only as names attached to someone else. Daughter of so-and-so, younger son of the king, half-sister of the prince. These are the little labels that history left behind. They do not come with personalities or quotes or dramatic scenes. They come with a single line, sometimes a couplet, and then silence. The royal family tree is full of these tiny branches that never really grew up. In Egypt, for example, the pharaohs kept careful lists of their children, but quality was not the priority. Quantity was. The more children a king had, the more options he had for alliances, marriages, and backups in case the main heir died unexpectedly. Some of these children were raised in the palace, given education, and even minor titles, but many of them never made it into the main story. They appear in tomb inscriptions or fragmentary records, then vanish. Their names are readable, but their lives are not. One common pattern is that royal daughters were used as diplomatic tools. They were married off to foreign kings, local governors, or temple officials. The idea was to strengthen alliances, secure loyalty, or at least show goodwill. The daughters themselves were rarely consulted. They were born, they were raised, and then they were sent away. Some of them disappear from the records after their marriage, as if their story ended when they crossed the border. The royal family may have remembered them, but history forgot. Sons had a different kind of invisibility. The eldest son, at least the one recognized as heir, got the attention. The younger sons were often given minor positions, sent to provincial courts, or quietly sidelined. In some cases, they were even eliminated if they seemed too ambitious. The ones who survived were often the ones who stayed quiet, who did not attract the wrong kind of notice. These are the forgotten royal sons, competent enough to be useful, but not important enough to be remembered. In the ancient Near East, royal families were especially large. Kings had many wives and many concubines, which meant large numbers of children. Some of these children were given administrative roles. Some were used as hostages in political arrangements. Some were simply left to live quietly in the background. Their names appear in lists of officials or in diplomatic correspondence, but they never appear in the main events of the story. They were there, but they were never central. Persia, with its vast Achaemenid court, had a similar pattern. The Persian kings had many children, and the court was full of princes and princesses who were never meant to rule. Some were given minor governorships or military commands. Some were used as hostages in diplomatic arrangements. Some were quietly removed from succession if they posed even the faintest threat to the main heir. The court kept detailed records, but those records are full of names that never appear again. The royal family tree is full of these ghostly branches. China, in the early imperial period, followed the same pattern. The emperors had many sons, and the court was full of princes who were never meant to inherit the throne. Some were given titles and small estates. Some were used as political tools. Some were quietly eliminated if they threatened the main line. The ones who survived were often the ones who stayed quiet and unambitious. Their names appear in dynastic records as Prince so-and-so, followed by a brief note that he died young or died without issue. That is all they get. And then there is Rome, where the early imperial family turned dynastic machinery into an art form. The children of emperors and their relatives were often used as political tools, bred for alliances, or quietly disappeared if they threatened the main line. Some of these children are mentioned only once in the works of a historian, then never again. They were born, they were recorded, and then they faded into the margins of the empire. So the forgotten royal children of antiquity share a quiet, almost invisible fate. They were born into power, but not into the center of it. They were surrounded by luxury, but not by lasting attention. They experienced the privileges of the palace, but also its cold practicality. The royal family needed them sometimes, but never for very long. And this is where the irony of ancient royalty becomes clear. The families that tried so hard to preserve their bloodlines often treated many of their own children as disposable. Sons were married off, daughters were exchanged, and extras were quietly set aside. The forgotten children are the evidence of this pattern. They are the ones who were never meant to be remembered, but who still existed long enough to be mentioned once. So as we move forward, we will meet a few of these forgotten royal children by name, by fragment, and by the quiet traces they left behind. They will not be the heroes of the story. They will be the background figures, the almost visible silhouettes, the ones whose lives remind us that even in the glitter of ancient courts, not every royal child got a spotlight. The forgotten royal children of antiquity rarely get to tell their own stories. Their lives are known only through the voices of others, scribes, priests, diplomats, and chroniclers, who had no interest in them as individuals. They appear as names in lists, as clauses in marriage agreements, as brief mentions in letters and inscriptions. They are not the main characters, but the minor details that someone, for whatever reason, decided to write down. That is how they survive, through someone else's paperwork. In Egypt, the records of the royal family are especially revealing. The pharaohs kept lists of their children, sometimes carved into stone, sometimes written on papyrus. These lists are long, full of names and full of gaps. Some of the children are followed by notes: died young, died without issue, married to X, gave birth to Y. Others are not followed by anything at all. Their names sit there, neatly inscribed, and then nothing. The records end where the lives apparently ended or faded out of importance. In the ancient Near East, the situation is similar. Royal children appear in administrative records, in marriage contracts, and in diplomatic correspondence. Some of them are mentioned as given in marriage to the king of X or sent to the court of Y. These are the children who were used as political tools, their lives dictated by the needs of the royal family. They were born, raised, and then sent away, often never to return. Their names are recorded, but their stories are not. Persia, with its vast Achaemenid court, is another rich source of forgotten royal children. The Persian kings had many children, and the court was full of princes and princesses who were never meant to inherit the throne. Some of these children appear in records as son of the king or daughter of the king, followed by a brief note about their marriage or their role in a minor court. Others are not mentioned at all. They existed, but they were never important enough to be recorded in detail. China, in the early imperial period, followed the same pattern. The emperors had many sons, and the court was full of princes who were never meant to rule. Some of these princes appear in dynastic records as Prince so-and-so, followed by a brief note that he died young, or died without issue. Others are mentioned only in the context of their marriages or their minor appointments. Their lives were recorded, but only in the most basic terms. They were there, but they were never central to the story. And then there is Rome, where the early imperial family turned dynastic machinery into an art form. The children of emperors and their relatives were often used as political tools, bred for alliances, or quietly disappeared if they threatened the main line. Some of these children are mentioned only once in the works of a historian, then never again. They were born, they were recorded, and then they faded into the margins of the empire. So the forgotten royal children of antiquity share a quiet, almost invisible fate. They were born into power, but not into the center of it. They were surrounded by luxury, but not by lasting attention. They experienced the privileges of the palace, but also its cold practicality. The royal family needed them sometimes, but never for very long. And this is where the irony of ancient royalty becomes clear. The families that tried so hard to preserve their bloodlines often treated many of their own children as disposable. Sons were married off, daughters were exchanged, and extras were quietly set aside. The forgotten children are the evidence of this pattern. They are the ones who were never meant to be remembered, but who still existed long enough to be mentioned once. So as we move forward, we will meet a few of these forgotten royal children by name, by fragment, and by the quiet traces they left behind. They will not be the heroes of the story. They will be the background figures, the almost visible silhouettes, the ones whose lives remind us that even in the glitter of ancient courts, not every royal child got a spotlight. At some point, if you keep reading through the records, the forgotten royal children stop being abstract. They become specific, even if briefly. There they are in a letter, a list, or a tiny inscription, a name, a parent, maybe a title. For a second, they are not just another one of the king's sons. They are a person someone bothered to write down. And then, almost always, the text moves on, and the name disappears again. In Egypt, for example, there are tomb inscriptions that list the children of a particular pharaoh, and then do nothing else with them. We might learn that a certain princess was married to a high priest, or that a younger prince died in childhood, but we rarely get more. The records are polite, formal, and economical. They state facts and then stop. There is no room for emotion, no space for personality. The princess is given in marriage. The prince is dead before reaching manhood, and that is the end of their public story. In Mesopotamia, the situation is similar. Royal archives are full of administrative texts, lists of rations, marriage contracts, and letters between kings. Some of these documents mention the children of royal families in passing. A letter might note that a princess has been sent to the court of another king as part of a treaty. A record might mention that a young prince has been appointed to a minor governorship. The child is there on the page, but the text is not interested in who they are. The child is a detail, not a subject. Persia, again, is a rich source of these fleeting appearances. The Achaemenid court was enormous, and the royal family tree was sprawling. Princes and princesses appear in lists of royal visitors, in marriage records, and in the accounts of Greek historians who sometimes mention them in passing. Some of these children are described briefly as beautiful, or well-favored, or beloved of the king, but these are momentary comments, not portraits. The historian records the observation and then moves on to the next point. The child remains in the background. In early imperial China, the dynastic histories are especially blunt about the forgotten princes. An entry might read something like, Prince X, son of Emperor Y, was born in such and such a year, sent to a remote commandery in his youth, and died without issue. End of paragraph. There is no reflection on his character, no description of his daily life, no hint of what he thought of being sent away. The text is purely functional. The prince is present, but only enough to be disposed of in a sentence. Rome, in its later imperial period, treats many of these children the same way. The works of historians and letter writers mention the children of emperors and their relatives, but usually only when they are useful to the political story. A princess might be mentioned when she is married to a foreign king. A prince might be noted when he is given a minor title or when he dies in suspicious circumstances. Outside of those moments, they are invisible. No one bothers to write about their habits, their pets, or their favorite foods. The forgotten royal children of Rome are just names in the margins of someone else's narrative, and that is perhaps the most striking thing about them, how little it takes to be remembered at all. A single inscription, one line in a letter, a mention in a list. That is enough to keep them from vanishing completely, but it is also enough to keep them from becoming real to us. They are not quite people, not quite ghosts. They are names that refuse to become stories. So when we look at the royal family trees of antiquity, we should not only see the rulers and the rebels and the famous spouses. We should also see the faint, half-erased branches, the children who were born, recorded, and then quietly forgotten. They are the quiet proof that even in the most glittering courts, most royal lives were never meant to matter in the long-term story. The forgotten royal children of ancient families were often trapped in a strange kind of luxury. They lived in palaces, not farms. They were surrounded by servants, not by work. They had food, shelter, and status, but they also had very little freedom. Their lives were shaped by the needs of the royal house, not by their own desires. That is a peculiar kind of childhood, privileged but not really free. In Egypt, royal children grew up in a world where everything was arranged for them. Their marriages were planned, their roles assigned, their futures mapped out before they could even understand the concept. A princess might be told she was to marry a foreign king, and that would be that. There was no discussion, no negotiation. The palace was a comfortable cage, lined with gold, but still a cage. In the Near East, royal children were often treated as political assets. A young prince might be sent to another court as a kind of informal hostage to ensure good behavior. A princess might be married off to a local governor or a friendly rival to seal an alliance. The child was not consulted. Their feelings were not recorded. They were instruments, not individuals. Persia's Achaemenid court was especially good at this. The royal family was vast and the court was enormous. Children of the king were sometimes given minor governorships, or sent to provincial courts, or used as hostages in diplomatic arrangements. The ones who did not threaten the main heir were allowed to live quietly. The ones who did were quietly removed from the succession. The royal family was like a giant machine, and the children were the moving parts that could be adjusted or replaced. In early imperial China, the situation was similar. Emperors had many sons, and the court was full of princes who were never meant to inherit the throne. Some were given titles and small estates. Some were used as political tools. Some were quietly eliminated if they threatened the main line. The ones who survived were often the ones who stayed quiet and unambitious. Their lives were comfortable, but they were not free. Rome, in its later imperial period, treated many of these children the same way. The children of emperors and their relatives were often used as political tools, bred for alliances, or quietly disappeared if they threatened the main line. Some of these children are mentioned only once in the works of a historian, then never again. They were born, they were recorded, and then they faded into the margins of the empire. So the forgotten royal children of antiquity share a quiet, almost invisible fate. They were born into power, but not into the center of it. They were surrounded by luxury, but not by lasting attention. They experienced the privileges of the palace, but also its cold, practical privilege. The royal family needed them sometimes, but never for very long. And that is perhaps the most striking thing about them, how much they were shaped by the expectations of others. Their lives were not their own. They were the property of the royal house, to be used, moved, or set aside as needed. The palace was a gilded trap, and the children were the ones who lived inside it, quietly, without much fanfare. So as we move forward, we will meet a few of these forgotten royal children by name, by fragment, and by the quiet traces they left behind. They will not be the heroes of the story. They will be the background figures, the almost visible silhouettes, the ones whose lives remind us that even in the glitter of ancient courts, not every royal child got a spotlight. The forgotten royal children of ancient families did not usually get dramatic endings. They did not die in famous battles or lead rebellions or overthrow dynasties. Their lives usually ended in one of the most ordinary ways possible, quietly. They grew up, they were used, they were set aside, and then they faded out of the record. The royal family tree kept growing, but their branches stopped. In Egypt, some royal children appear in the records once as daughter of the king or younger son of the king, and then disappear. The inscriptions mention their birth, their marriage, or their death, and then the text moves on. There is no ceremony, no reflection, no grand farewell. The child is noted, accounted for, and then treated as if they had never been a person worth much consideration. In the Near East, the same pattern repeats. A princess is mentioned when she is sent to another court, or when she is married to a governor. A prince is noted when he is given a minor title, or when he dies in obscurity. The records state the fact and then move on. The child's life is reduced to a sentence, and the sentence is treated as a closing remark. Persia's Achaemenid court is no different. The royal annals and the Greek historians mention princes and princesses only when they are useful to the political story. A princess is noted when she is married to a foreign king. A prince is mentioned when he is given a minor governorship or when he is removed from succession. Outside of those moments, they are invisible. The records do not record their feelings, their thoughts, or their private lives. They are just names in the margins of someone else's narrative. In early imperial China, the dynastic histories are especially blunt about the forgotten princes. An entry might read something like, Prince X, son of Emperor Y, was born in such and such a year, sent to a remote commandery in his youth, and died without issue. End of paragraph. There is no reflection on his character, no description of his daily life, no hint of what he thought of being sent away. The text is purely functional. The prince is present, but only enough to be disposed of in a sentence. Rome, in its later imperial period, treats many of these children the same way. The works of historians and letter writers mention the children of emperors and their relatives, but usually only when they are useful to the political story. A princess might be mentioned when she is married to a foreign king. A prince might be noted when he is given a minor title, or when he dies in suspicious circumstances. Outside of those moments, they are invisible. No one bothers to write about their habits, their pets, or their favorite foods. The forgotten royal children of Rome are just names in the margins of someone else's narrative. So the forgotten royal children of antiquity share a quiet, almost invisible fate. They were born into power, but not into the center of it. They were surrounded by luxury, but not by lasting attention. They experienced the privileges of the palace, but also its cold practicality. The royal family needed them sometimes, but never for very long. And that is perhaps the most striking thing about them, how much they were shaped by the expectations of others. Their lives were not their own. They were the property of the royal house, to be used, moved, or set aside as needed. The palace was a gilded trap, and the children were the ones who lived inside it, quietly, without much fanfare. So the story of the forgotten children of ancient royal families ends where it began, in the background. They were there, but they were never central. They were born, they were recorded, and then they faded into obscurity. The royal family tree is full of these little branches that never really grew up, and that is the quiet, unremarkable end of the topic. Medieval people smelled. Let's just start there. They were not inaccurate human perfumes wandering through the countryside. They were humans, with bodies, with clothes, with limited soap, and with a lot of open air acting as a very forgiving filter. The average medieval person probably did not wake up thinking, I need to be slightly less like a cheese wheel today. But that was, from a modern perspective, the general aesthetic. They smelled like sweat, smoke, animal, and a little bit of whatever they had eaten the day before. If you step back from the idea of medieval as a clean, romantic setting and look at it like a documentary with bad CGI and a fuzzy camera, the smell becomes obvious. Medieval towns were full of animals, people, rubbish, open drains, and wood smoke. Houses were close together, often with livestock living in the same building or right next to it. People brewed, roasted, baked, dried, tanned, and fermented, all without modern ventilation, so the air was not fresh, it was occupied. Let's start with the humans themselves. Most medieval people did not have daily hot showers. They did not have pumps of liquid soap sitting in their bathrooms. They had water, usually cold, and cloth, and sometimes a bit of basic lye soap if they were lucky. Bathing, especially in the earlier Middle Ages, was more of an occasional event than a routine. People might wash their hands, their face, or, on a good day, their feet. Full immersion baths were rare and usually reserved for the very rich or for special occasions. The lower-class people, the farmers, the labourers, the servants, were the ones who smelled the most by accident. They worked with animals, with manure, with grain, with mud, with sweat. They stood in fields. They walked in rain. They slept in shared spaces. They did not have multiple changes of clothes. They had one or two outfits, worn until they were stiff with dirt and sweat, then washed, eventually. When they slept, they were not lying between clean sheets so much as between blankets that had absorbed an entire week of weather, labor, and bodily emissions. Medieval clothing was made of wool, linen, and sometimes leather. Wool, especially when unwashed, holds odor very well. Linen can be fresher, but it also absorbs sweat and food stains. Clothes were often reused for years. A child's shirt might become a cleaning rag might become padding for a bed might become firewood. The fibers were recycled and the smell along with them, so even if someone had washed their face, the rest of their body and their clothes were still doing their best medieval ambient aroma impression. Then there were the streets. Towns in the Middle Ages were not clean, open, sparkly places. They were crowded, muddy, and full of runoff. People lived close to the street, often with animals in the same building or right outside. Dogs, pigs, chickens, and horses roamed freely in many places, leaving their own contributions to the general bouquet. People threw organic waste into the streets, where it mixed with rainwater, mud, and whatever else had been stepping in it for weeks. The smell was not subtle. It was a persistent, low-level background hum. In the countryside, the smell profile shifted a little, but it did not get better. It just got more rural. Open fields, manure piles, drying hay, animal pens, and smoke from cooking fires dominated the air. People moved in and out of these spaces all day, so their clothes picked up the environment. A farmer smelling like a stable was not a sign of a bad day. It was a sign of a normal day. The line between working in the environment and being part of the environment was very thin. Let's also talk about the breath. Medieval diets were often based on bread, grains, vegetables, and fermented dairy. Meat was expensive. So many people ate it rarely. They also ate a lot of pungent foods, onions, garlic, cabbage, and whatever herbs were available. These foods lingered. Add in limited dental hygiene. People did not have toothbrushes, toothpaste, or regular cleanings. They might use rags, sticks, or very basic pastes, but nothing close to modern dental care. Teeth rotted, gums bled, breath was intense. Alcohol was another factor. People drank a lot of beer, ale, wine, and other fermented drinks, often because water was not always safe. These drinks were not always clean either, and they added their own sour, yeasty layer to the general human smell. A crowded tavern, packed with people drinking, eating, and talking, would have been a very rich, very layered olfactory experience. It was not a place you would walk into today and call pleasant, unless you had a very specific tolerance for mixed odors. And then there were the animals. Medieval people lived with animals in a way that modern city dwellers rarely do. Goats might be kept in alleys, chickens in courtyards, pigs in the street, cows in small pens near the house. The smell of animal dung, urine and wet fur was part of daily life. People's homes were saturated with the smell of whatever they were raising. This was normal. It was just the background. It was not shocking to them. It was just the way things were. So, realistically, a medieval person smelled like a composite of all this. They smelled like sweat, smoke, bread, animals, manure, and the faint but persistent ghost of yesterday's meal. Their breath was strong, their clothes were stained, their hair was probably greasy, and their body was not scrubbed every day. They were not monsters. They were just people living in a world that did not have the same hygiene standards we do now. And that is the important thing to remember. The smell of the Middle Ages was not a moral judgment, it was a logistical one. People lived in a different sensory environment. They were used to it. It did not bother them in the same way it would bother us. Their noses were tuned to the world they lived in, and for the most part, they just kept going. Medieval towns had a very particular smell profile. If you could somehow bottle typical medieval urban aroma, it would be a mix of damp stone, smoke, bread, animals, and something vaguely sour that you would not want to analyze too closely. Towns were crowded, built close together, with narrow streets where air did not circulate very well. The buildings themselves were made of stone, wood and plaster, all of which absorbed smells over time. The walls did not stay clean. They accumulated generations of smoke, cooking fumes, and whatever got splashed against them. In the early morning, the dominant smell was often bread and smoke. Bakers were among the first people to start work, preparing loaves for the day. The ovens burned wood or charcoal, so the air was full of heat and smoke. As people walked through the streets, they passed the bakery, the butchers, the fishmongers, and the stalls selling whatever was in season. The smell of fresh bread mixed with the smell of raw meat, offal, and fish. Fish, in particular, could be very strong in a world without refrigeration. It was sold quickly, often in open air, and it did not stay fresh very long. Then there were the open drains, if they existed at all. In many medieval towns, there were no proper sewers. People threw waste into the streets or into nearby ditches. Organic matter, urine, and whatever else accumulated there. Over time, it fermented. It stank. It attracted flies, rats, and other animals. The smell of decay was a constant background note, especially in the warmer months. In the winter, it was a bit quieter, but the cold did not make it pleasant. It just made it slower, more subtle, and more persistent. Taverns and inns were another major source of smell. These places were crowded, noisy, and full of people drinking, eating, and talking. The floors were often covered in straw, which absorbed spills, urine, and whatever else landed on it. The smell of spilled beer, leftover food, and damp straw formed a thick, heavy layer in the air. People might sit there for hours, talking, drinking, and slowly contributing to the overall atmosphere. The smell was not subtle, it was immersive. In the countryside, the smell was different, but not cleaner. Villages were smaller, more spread out, and more connected to the land. The smell of animals was dominant. Cows, pigs, sheep, goats, chickens, and horses were all around. Their dung, their urine, their hay, and their bodies all contributed to the general aroma. The air was full of the smell of manure, hay, and animal breath. The houses were made of wattle and daub, which were porous and absorbed smells. The thatched roofs trapped smoke and moisture. The interiors were smoky, and more smoky. The smoke came from the hearths, where people cooked, heated, and dried things. The central hearth was the heart of the house, but it was also the main source of indoor air pollution. The smoke did not always vent out perfectly. It stayed in the house, coated the walls, and soaked into the clothes and the bedding. The smell of wood smoke was everywhere, inside and out. It clung to the walls, the furniture, the people. It was a comforting smell when it was associated with warmth and food, but it was also a constant reminder of the limitations of ventilation. Water was another factor. People washed in streams, rivers or wells, depending on where they lived. These sources were often shared with animals, with people dumping waste into them, or with runoff from the fields. The water was not always clean. The smell of stagnant water, of mud, of algae, and of whatever had been washed into it was common. People still used it because they had to. They did not have a lot of choice. The smell was part of the environment. So the smell of the Middle Ages was not a single thing. It was a combination of many things, layered together. The smell of smoke, the smell of animals, the smell of sweat, the smell of decay, the smell of bread, the smell of alcohol, the smell of damp stone, the smell of mud. It was a rich, complex, and very organic environment. People lived in it, breathed in it, absorbed it into their clothes and their bodies. It was just the way the world smelled. They were used to it. It was not shocking. It was just normal. And that is the important thing to remember. The smell of the Middle Ages was not a moral judgment. It was a logistical one. People lived in a world that did not have the same hygiene standards we do now. They did not have the same tools, the same knowledge, the same infrastructure. They did what they could with what they had. The smell was a side effect of that. It was a byproduct of the way they lived. It was not a choice exactly. It was a consequence. So when we talk about what medieval people really smelled like, we are not talking about something shocking or revolting. We are talking about something ordinary. People smelled like the world they lived in. The world they lived in was full of animals, of smoke, of sweat, of decay, of bread, of alcohol, of mud, of water. The smell was just a reflection of that. It was a reflection of the way they lived, the way they worked, the way they moved through the world. It was a smell that was normal to them, even if it might be overwhelming to us. If you think the average peasant was a walking smell festival, imagine the nobility, who bathed more often but also wore expensive clothes, ate richer food, and crowded themselves into rooms that rarely got fresh air. The higher you went in the social ladder, the more the smell became a kind of performance. The smell of wealth, the smell of power, the smell of layers of fabric, sweat and candle smoke, all wrapped together. It was not cleaner, it was just more complicated. Medieval aristocrats did wash sometimes. They were more likely to have access to warm water, to soap, to baths, and to clean linens. But baths in the Middle Ages were still not like modern showers. People might sit in a tub, sponge themselves, and change their finest clothes more often than the poor did. But they were still human. They still sweated. They still ate food that lingered. They still lived in rooms that were full of candles, food, people, and animals. The clothes of the nobility were heavy, layered, and expensive. They were made of wool, silk, linen, and other fabrics that held odor. A nobleman might wear a tunic, a cloak, stockings, a coif or cap, and various accessories. A noblewoman might wear an underdress, a gown, a veil, and layers of fabric that did not breathe very well. The clothing was tight, layered, and often worn for long periods. The sweat soaked into the fabric. The smell of the body mixed with the smell of the fabric. The smell of the perfume, the smell of the candle smoke, the smell of the animals that sometimes wandered into the hall, all layered together. Perfume and spices were used to mask the smell. Aristocrats had access to expensive scents, herbs, flowers, spices, and oils. They might carry small pouches of herbs, wear scented gloves, or use perfumed oils on their skin and clothes. The smell of roses, of lavender, of spices, of myrrh, and of whatever else was available added another layer to the general aroma. But perfume in the Middle Ages was not subtle. It was strong, bold, and often used to cover up the underlying smell rather than replace it. The result was a very thick, very rich, very layered smell. It was not clean, it was layered. The food of the nobility was another factor. They ate more meat, more dairy, more spices, and more rich dishes. The smell of roasting meat, of boiling stews, of baking bread, of fermenting wine, and of whatever else was being prepared in the kitchen filled the halls. The smell of food mixed with the smell of people, the smell of animals, the smell of smoke, and the smell of whatever the noble person had been doing before. The result was a very rich, very organic, very medieval smell. It was a smell that was full of life, full of energy, full of the world. So the smell of the nobility was not clean. It was sophisticated. It was a smell that was layered, complex, and carefully constructed. The nobility tried to cover up the smell of sweat, of decay, of animals, and of whatever else was going on with the smell of perfume, of spices, of food, and of candle smoke. The result was a smell that was very different from the smell of the peasant, but not necessarily better. It was just more complicated. It was a smell that was full of contradictions, full of layers, full of the way the world worked. The peasants, on the other hand, were more honest about their smell. They were the ones who lived in the open air, who worked with the land, who were the closest to the animals, to the earth, to the water, to the mud. Their smell was more direct, more simple, more straightforward. The smell of sweat, of manure, of hay, of smoke, of bread, of whatever they had eaten. It was a smell that was very clear, very present, very immediate. It was a smell that was not hiding anything. It was a smell that was just being itself. So when we talk about what medieval people really smelled like, we are talking about something that was very different depending on who you were, where you lived, and what you did. The peasant smelled like the world they lived in. The noble smelled like the world they lived in, but with more layers, more perfume, more food, more people, more animals. The smell was not a moral judgment. It was a logistical one. It was a reflection of the way they lived, the way they worked, the way they moved through the world. It was a smell that was normal to them, even if it might be overwhelming to us. It was a smell that was just being itself, smell-wise. The smell of the Middle Ages was not just about people. It was about places. The church, the market, the stable, the tavern, the street, the field. Each place had its own smell profile, its own olfactory identity. The church smelled like incense, candle smoke, beeswax, and the faint ghostly hint of the dead. The market smelled like fresh bread, raw meat, fish, herbs, spices, and the slightly sour, slightly sourier smell of whatever was not quite fresh. The stable smelled like manure, hay, animals, urine, and the warm, damp, furry smell of whatever was living there. The church was a place of ritual, of ceremony, of incense. The smell of incense was important. It was a sign of holiness, of purity, of the divine. The incense masked the smell of the building, the smell of the people, the smell of the dead. The church was full of bodies, of candles, of incense, of whatever the congregation had brought in with them. The result was a smell that was rich, complex, almost sweet. The smell of the church was a smell that was meant to be comforting, to be uplifting, to be something that lifted the nose along with the spirit. The market was a different story. The market was a place of commerce, of exchange, of life. The smell of the market was the smell of the world in microcosm. The smell of bread, the smell of meat, the smell of fish, the smell of herbs, the smell of spices, the smell of whatever the seller had been doing that day. The market was full of people, of animals, of carts, of wagons, of whatever was being sold, of whatever was being bought. The smell was chaotic, rich, very alive. The smell of the market was a smell that was full of energy, full of movement, full of the way the world worked. The stable was another place with its own smell. The stable was full of animals, of manure, of hay, of urine, of the warm, damp, furry smell of the animals living there. The stable was a place of work, of labor, of the animals that were the backbone of the medieval economy. The smell of the stable was a smell that was very direct, very honest, very present. It was a smell that was not hiding anything. It was a smell that was just being itself. The smell of the stable was a smell that was very medieval, very organic, very animal. So the smell of the Middle Ages was not a single thing. It was a combination of many things layered together. The smell of the church, the smell of the market, the smell of the stable, the smell of the tavern, the smell of the street, the smell of the field. It was a smell that was full of life, full of energy, full of the way the world worked. The smell was not a moral judgment. It was a logistical one. It was a reflection of the way people lived, the way they worked, the way they moved through the world. The smell was normal to them, even if it might be overwhelming to us. The smell was just being itself, and that is the important thing to remember. The smell of the Middle Ages was not a moral judgment. It was a logistical one. It was a reflection of the way people lived, the way they worked, the way they moved through the world. The smell was a byproduct of that. It was a consequence of the way they lived. It was not a choice exactly. It was a result of the way things were. The smell was the way the world smelled. It was the way the world was. The smell was the smell of the world. The smell of the Middle Ages changed with the time of day and the season. The smell of the night was different from the smell of the day. The smell of the summer was different from the smell of the winter. The smell of the spring was different from the smell of the autumn. The smell was a living thing, always shifting, always moving, always changing, always being. At night, the smell was quieter. The streets were quieter, the people were quieter, the animals were quieter, the world was quieter. The smell of the night was a smell that was softer, more subtle, more distant. The smell of the night was the smell of the world at rest, at rest, at rest. The smell of the night was the smell of the world sleeping, sleeping, sleeping. The smell of the night was the smell of the world being quiet, being calm, being peaceful. The smell of the summer was a smell that was warm, humid, heavy, thick, full of life. The smell of the summer was the smell of flowers, of grass, of animals, of sweat, of whatever was growing, of whatever was living, of whatever was moving. The smell of the summer was a smell that was very alive, very present, very immediate. The smell of the summer was the smell of the world being warm, being humid, being full of life. The smell of the winter was a smell that was cold, dry, thin, sharp, distant. The smell of the winter was the smell of snow, of ice, of wood smoke, of whatever was burning, of whatever was being kept warm. The smell of the winter was a smell that was quiet, still, empty, cold. The smell of the winter was the smell of the world being cold, being quiet, being still. The smell of the spring was a smell that was fresh, green, new, alive, growing. The smell of the spring was the smell of flowers, of grass, of animals, of whatever was being born, of whatever was growing, of whatever was moving. The smell of the spring was the smell of the world being new, being alive, being full of life. The smell of the autumn was a smell that was rich, heavy, sweet, decaying. The smell of the autumn was the smell of leaves, of fruit, of animals, of whatever was being harvested, of whatever was being gathered, of whatever was being stored. The smell of the autumn was the smell of the world being full, being rich, being heavy with the weight of the harvest. So the smell of the Middle Ages was not a single thing. It was a combination of many things layered together. The smell of the night, the smell of the day, the smell of the summer, the smell of the winter, the smell of the spring, the smell of the autumn. The smell was a living thing, always shifting, always moving, always changing, always being. The smell was normal to the people of the time. It was the way the world smelled. It was the way the world was. The smell was the smell of the world, and that is the important thing to remember. The smell of the Middle Ages was not a moral judgment, it was a logistical one. It was a reflection of the way people lived, the way they worked, the way they moved through the world. The smell was a byproduct of that. It was a consequence of the way things were. The smell was not a choice exactly. It was a result of the way the world worked. The smell was the way the world smelled. It was the way the world was. The smell was the smell of the world. So when we talk about what medieval people really smelled like, we are talking about something that was very different depending on who you were, where you lived, and what you did. The smell was a reflection of the way they lived, the way they worked, the way they moved through the world. The smell was normal to them, even if it might be overwhelming to us. The smell was just being itself. The smell was the smell of the world, and that is the quiet, unremarkable end of the topic. The smell of the Middle Ages is gone. It is not something we can actually experience now. We can describe it. We can imagine it. We can talk about it. But we cannot truly smell it. The world has changed. The way people live, the way they work, the way they move through the world has changed. The smell of the world has changed. The smell of the past is a memory, a reconstruction, a guess, a best effort based on the way things were. We can read about the way people lived, the way they worked, the way they moved through the world. We can read about the way they smelled, the way their clothes smelled, the way their homes smelled, the way their streets smelled, the way their animals smelled, the way their food smelled, the way their breath smelled. We can read about the way they tried to cover up the smell with perfume, with herbs, with spices, with incense, with whatever they had. We can read about the way they lived in a world that did not have the same hygiene standards we do now. We can read about the way they lived in a world that smelled the way it did. But we cannot truly smell it. The smell is gone. The past is gone. The world has moved on. The smell of the past is a memory, a reconstruction, a guess, a best effort. It is not something we can truly experience. It is something we can only imagine, only describe, only talk about. And that is perhaps the most striking thing about it. The smell of the Middle Ages is a thing that is gone. It is a thing that was real, that was there, that was part of the way people lived, the way they worked, the way they moved through the world. It was a thing that was normal to them, even if it might be overwhelming to us. It was a thing that was just being itself. It was the smell of the world. So the story of what medieval people really smelled like ends where it began, in the past. The smell is gone. The world has changed. The way people live, the way they work, the way they move through the world has changed. The smell of the world has changed. The smell of the past is a memory, a reconstruction, a guess, a best effort. It is not something we can truly experience. It is something we can only imagine, only describe, only talk about. And that is the quiet, unremarkable end of the topic. The smell of the Middle Ages is gone. The world has moved on. The smell of the past is a memory, a reconstruction, a guess, a best effort. It is the way the world was. It is the way the world used to be. It is the smell of the world, gone, moved on, changed. And that is all there is to say about it.